Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. My name is Pilar and I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant, a company where we help managers of remote teams to get the most out of online collaboration. You can find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com. Hello and welcome to episode 337 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. I'm your host, Pilar, and today I have two guests with me. So I'm delighted to introduce you to Tammy Bjelland, who's the CEO of Workplaceless, and also Theresa Hollema, who's the author of Virtual Teams Across Cultures. And, well, they're not both together with me. They weren't together with each other. I first recorded with Tammy, and then I brought Theresa in to give us some further thoughts on the subject. And what we're looking at this month, because if you listen to the last episode, you might remember that Maya and I were saying that we're going for a slightly different format for the podcast, which is each month is dedicated to a theme. So first we have the guest episode, and then Maya and I will comment on some of the themes that came out. And the theme for this month of October 2023 is career progression in remote teams. So Tammy is going to talk about exactly that. So how can people progress through their careers as remote employees? We touch on some of the challenges, etc. But mainly we're looking at remote teams where people are working from home. And then Theresa, who's an expert in global virtual teams, then gives us our take on the subject just for about 5 or 6 minutes, just some thoughts that she had when she listened to the interview with Tammy. So 2 people for you today. Now, before we move on to the conversation with our lovely guests, who, by the way, have both been on the show before. I love talking to people again to see how their thinking evolves and what's on their minds. Before I leave you with those conversations, a reminder that you can get in touch through virtualnotdistant.com, or you can email me directly, pilar@virtualnotdistant.com. I'd love to hear your thoughts and also whether you have any topics that you would like to hear more about. So let's start with Tammy Bjelland, who is the CEO of Workplaceless. Back on the show is Tammy Bjelland, who's the CEO of Workplaceless. So welcome, Tammy.
Thank you so much for having me back, Pilar. I'm happy to be here.
Tammy, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is because at some point on LinkedIn, where you are very active, there was one post, but you also posted an article, a link to an article about IBM, the CEO of IBM, saying that actually remote work could hurt your career. And so for listeners who might not have met you before, you, of course, have been in the online remote space, in the learning technology space for... How long have you been with Workplaceless? When did you set that up?
So Workplaceless started in 2017. So in September, actually. So we're coming up on our 6th anniversary.
Wow, congratulations. And we are recording on the 10th of August of 2023. And okay, so let's start there. What was the article saying, Tammy?
Yeah, so it's one article of many examples, really, of high-level executives or high-level leaders in companies saying that the reason that they want employees back in the office is because it will hurt their career if they don't return. So it's couched in or presented as this concern for people's career progression, as opposed to, recognizing that perhaps the dangers to the career progression are internal practices or internal attitudes and behaviors. And it is just one example of many of warnings of flexible work potentially hurting people's careers.
And when you shared that article, I thought, I can't believe this, because I think I shared it with you in 2016. Jack Welch actually wrote a post on LinkedIn saying the same thing: working remotely will kill your career. And he was very specifically talking about CEOs and people who wanted to rise right to the top. But I thought, wow, nothing's changed.
Nothing has changed. And really, every major US publication anyway recently has published some sort of article to that effect of, one of the reasons that we should be concerned about increasing flexible work is the potential damage that it could do to people's careers. And really, actually, that danger to your career is really why I started Workplaceless, because I wanted to continue working remotely in my career. And it was very challenging in the companies that I was working in to access leadership opportunities unless I relocated. And I had no interest in relocating. I knew that I could do what I wanted to do remotely. And so I had to move around. And then I started my own business to address this challenge. But it is, unfortunately, as companies are currently implementing flexible work, it is a danger to people's careers. It shouldn't be that way, right? It should be actually many doors opening for people's careers because you can access opportunities that don't exist in your local area, right? So in its most basic form, flexible work opens the door to career opportunities to more people. But when it comes to career progression, especially in companies that are larger or have a longer history of being co-located, it becomes increasingly challenging to access those advanced opportunities if you want to maintain the level of flexibility that is valuable to you.
Yeah, because what I'm thinking is that it's difficult to progress your career if you're remote within an organization that doesn't operate like an organization where people are remote.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And I think, with the increased number of remote or flexible options, I think many companies are thinking, well, that's it. We've done what we need to do to make things accessible and equitable and inclusive. And they're not putting in the effort and the resources needed to make sure that the way that they're operating actually enables those ideal outcomes. They're just calling things flexible and saying, well, now we're inclusive. And it is much more difficult than that, as companies are discovering. So there's a real danger, I think, in failing to recognize the internal practices and behaviors and attitudes that are, in fact, keeping remote career progression from being truly attainable.
Of course, now that we've got the hybrid setup, and that seems to be the more popular one amongst leaders, managers, and people, there's a double. We've really got to be careful. What I'm hearing is that it's got two parts to it, making sure that remote people don't fall behind in their careers within an organization. I mean, we can go into people who want to progress outside of their organization later, maybe. But within an organization, it seems to me it's the organization's responsibility and it's the individual's responsibility to do that. Shall we pick up on that, on the individual versus the organization? Where shall we start?
Yeah, so I think since we're talking about organizations, we can start there and then talk about the individual. Because what an organization invests in or recognizes as important can limit what an individual is able to accomplish within that structure. In terms of what an organization can do, number one, really evaluate which jobs have to be in office and which jobs have or can be remote or have additional flexibility. I do not believe that the jobs that are listed right now as, it's essential that you come into the office. I do not believe that 100% of those jobs are accurately described, right? I was just looking at some job openings for a little research project I was doing in the learning and development space. And almost all of them required being in the office at least 3 days a week. Is mind-blowing to me, right? So number one is really looking at what jobs can be accomplished in a flexible environment and which jobs really cannot. And creating a plan for enabling that flexibility to take place. The next thing that organizations really should be doing is preparing managers to effectively manage remote employees and enable those desired performance outcomes, regardless of where those employees are located. Mm-hmm. So lack of manager preparation is a huge issue because, number one, many managers get promoted because they're good at what they do. They're not necessarily good at managing. Yes. And so if they don't receive any training or preparation in managing skills, and they don't receive any preparation or training in managing remote employees, you're setting everybody up for failure. You are setting up those managers to be either overwhelmed and burned out by, trying to micromanage their remote employees, or by completely failing to support their employees at all and potentially blaming employees for not achieving performance outcomes that those managers were not able to coach their employees to achieve. So manager training is a big gap. And then also just training in general. So the career and professional development resources that are provided to employees, making sure that those are built with a distributed lens. So making sure that the skills that you're teaching, as well as the resources you're providing, they're not perpetuating proximity bias. They're not perpetuating these anti-remote work biases. Remote workers need to be able to see examples that are relevant to them, as well as career paths and options that have flexibility. So with training, with career pathing, both of those things need to be built with a distributed lens and evaluated to make sure that you're not perpetuating this in-office requirement, and you are really capturing and reflecting the experience of all employees, no matter where they're working from.
Yeah. Let me pick you up on the last point about training resources, and not just that the training is available online or in person, right, but that actually that the content has been designed with this variety of location and setups and flexibility in mind. What does this involve? Does this involve making sure that, for example, the skills we're providing or the skills we're focusing on are skills that we can do from anywhere? Or what are some of the nuances of making sure that that is happening?
The first thing that I would recommend is to even just identify which employees and how many employees have workplace flexibility in their structure. That is a first thing, right? You need, when you're designing and delivering training, you should know whether the organization you're delivering to or the team you're delivering to, whether they are remote or whether they're hybrid. So having an understanding of the audience, so you can design that training so it's relevant to them. And then the next thing would just be to identify any gaps. If there are performance differences between different groups, you would need to be able to identify like what those gaps are and why are those gaps happening, right? Is it because of a lack of training? Is it because of a lack of management that is relevant to those groups of employees? Then making sure when you're designing new training, including workplace flexibility as a characteristic in the learner personas, in the storyboards that you're working from, to make sure that you're always thinking about this experience of the remote worker. Then including effective remote work practices within content and looking at those skills. So this is basically what you just said earlier, which is making sure that the skills are achievable or they're applicable in any environment, whether it's remote or on-site, and making sure that those desired outcomes, whether it's a learning outcome or a performance outcome, making sure that those can be achieved by an employee if they're working remotely or if they're working on-site. And then providing examples of flexible work scenarios, and removing anything that might perpetuate any biases that are anti-flexibility. So those are some of the things that organizations can do.
No wonder
Yes.
it's taking so long. It's so much.
It's true. Yeah. And I don't, I just wrote a blog post about this actually, because I was blown away. I've been having several conversations with different training providers and vendors. And in multiple instances, they said to me, we designed this training or we're delivering this training, and I actually don't know if they're remote or hybrid. And I was thinking, what? Like, how do you not know a basic thing? Like, if you know their function, right? Your project manager or like sales representative, you know their function. How do you not know how or where they're doing their work? That seems to me like such a basic characteristic that would really drive their experience and their motivations. And I think because I've been in it so long, and I know you've been in it so long, that for us, it's second nature to just look at things from a distributed lens. That's not the case for most everybody else. And so it really does take practice. And that's where I think people like you and I come in, where we challenge some of the things that we're seeing, or we challenge, the way that things are being presented. And we ask the question, which is this representative and is this helpful for remote workers? Or is this in any way keeping remote workers from achieving what they need to achieve? And it takes practice.
Yeah, I'm glad you're saying that. I'm so glad you're saying that it takes practice, because it's obviously not in the DNA of many organizations. They had this gap where, of course, lots of people were in lockdown. And then coming back, it's like, okay, we've sorted out our hybrid working policies. Okay, let's move on. And it's like, oh, hang on. It really needs to really sip into every part of the organization. And unless, like you say, you're very conscious about it and consciously reminding yourself of it, unless you have that practice of doing that, it's not there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard. And that really, I mean, we were going to end up in the individual space anyway. And I think this might be a good segue. That's really how individuals can help, ensuring that organizations and even their coworkers and managers are aware of the differences of what it means to be effective in remote work versus in a co-located environment, and really advocating. And it doesn't matter whether you want to be a thought leader in this space or not, but everyone who values flexibility and wants to continue to be able to access flexible work opportunities and grow in their career should consider themselves an advocate for flexible work. And part of that includes drawing attention to any situations that might hinder that accessibility to flexible work. And in many cases, it's unintentional actions that just occur because we're working really quickly and we're trying to get things done. And it's impossible to think of all the things all the time when you are making decisions and moving forward in work. But anyone that's working flexibly can be that person that says, hey, we're having this meeting and we just called it last minute and we're all in person, but what about our coworkers that aren't here today? Like how do we make sure that they're involved? So just asking those questions about how to make sure that we can include everyone that needs to be included.
And in doing that as well, whether we prefer working in the office or in a co-work, whatever whatever the location, the more we can be a little bit more conscious of all of this, the better our own work experience is going to be as well. Doesn't matter if we're in an office all the time, if we're constantly leaving out our remote colleagues. And also even, I'm thinking, let's go a bit more into the individual and also let's look at career pathways within organizations. I don't know, I suppose that many of especially the larger ones, have ways in which people are promoted, considered for promotion, etc. How can those be adjusted? I don't even know, because location probably isn't even a named factor in a lot of those ways of promoting people, and even if they've got any procedures or processes of doing that. What are some of the things that maybe HR and senior managers can be thinking about
I would again look at leadership opportunities and make sure that, any kind of location restriction is evaluated for whether it's really necessary or not. So in many like leadership opportunities or job openings that you see for leadership positions, you might see like relocation required or like ability to report into headquarters 3 times a week is required. So looking at those within the organization and seeing what is really required and what's not. And then looking at the history of promotions in the organization and whether, so this is where it's helpful to know, whether employees are flexible or like what level of flexibility they have, and evaluating the data on how many employees in this group are promoted versus this group. And are there any trends that we see where, people who are fully remote just are not promoted at the same rate as other employees. So achieving an equal rate of promotion among the different groups of employees is one objective that an organization can aspire to. Also looking at what are some examples of career paths that flexible employees have had. So when you look at senior leaders or you look at people in your organization that you would like to model your career after, it would be very helpful for organizations to highlight examples that include workplace flexibility as a factor in career decisions. So providing examples is just a really great way to inspire employees, if they do value flexibility, to see where they could go in your organization. Because if every possible career path ends at HQ, if you have an employee that truly values flexibility, they're going to look elsewhere. So it's in an organization's best interest to highlight the opportunities that are available if you value flexibility.
I'm wondering as well whether organizations should at some point say, okay, we're going to have all our senior leadership, including the CEO, 100% remote for, I don't know, a couple of months.
Unlikely. I mean, yes. although it's really interesting because hybrid work is actually among very senior leaders, among CEOs. I mean, that's one of the things that is a benefit, right? It's like a power indicator, a status indicator is the level of flexibility that you have and whether you can go play golf in the middle of the week.
Exactly. So they should be embracing that, and if that's helped their careers and their development.
Unfortunately, I think a lot of the mindset is, I would love for everyone to think that way, but I think there's a lot of mindset of like, I had to be in the office as I was growing in my career, and that's why I've achieved the flexibility that I have. So there's a little bit of this idea that if I suffered,
others have to as well. And how about, so what is it? I'm trying to understand as well. What is it? Is it that we still think that the office is the proper space for working and for connecting with your employees? That we're thinking that the more senior we are, that we're thinking that you can only advance in your career. And by advance, I think, unfortunately, we're meaning more going up the management ladder in this conversation.
Yes, yeah, I know what you're saying.
Yeah, which is another thing that you mentioned before as well. Is it that we think that the office is where things happen, and therefore if you want to have a position where strategic thinking or understanding more what's going on in the organization and in the industry, then you have to be present where things are happening? Is it that, or is it, what else is that?
I think it is that. I do think that it is a mindset that is really driven by what you know and what you are aware of. And I think there's not a lot of examples of companies that are doing it a different way. And especially if you're in the middle of, your career, you might not be researching like examples of companies that are doing things in a fully remote way, right? So it's a lack of awareness, I think, of potential alternatives. And it's even a lack of awareness that there might be potential alternatives, right? Because you don't know what you don't know. And so if you have never even considered that there's a different way to work, it's very jarring to think, oh, there's a whole other world out there of companies that never, like, they don't even have a physical headquarters, and they can, achieve their outcomes, and people are happy and productive. Like, I think it's pretty mind blowing. I mean, I was just thinking about this morning because I was thinking, during the pandemic, or the height of the pandemic anyway, we were thinking, oh, everyone's going to know, like, how everyone knows now that you can achieve all of your objectives working remotely, and we don't have to do that work of like educating, and getting people familiar with that idea. And yet here we are. And I think that it's still the case, because the majority of those companies that went remote didn't think about implementing a long-term strategic remote plan. And that, you and I know that that's just different. It's different than, applying remote practices in the short term. So I think that is one of the biggest things, is just this lack of awareness. And so, again, I call on remote work advocates to highlight these examples of companies really exploring new ways of working. And I love that about, the times that we live in. I think it's really just wonderful that companies are publicly showcasing how they work. I think that's just a really fascinating study, just in transparency, as well as companies looking at the ways that they work as another product.
Yes.
That they can sell, right, to other employees or to other companies. I think that's just a fascinating time to be alive and working in this space.
I've never thought of it like that. I've always thought about it as a way of being transparent and stuff, but actually you're right. And it is true that we've seen a lot of that in all kinds of places, just, creating that thought leadership, not in our field, but actually, I mean, I'm not the royal we everyone, and not in our field maybe, but actually in the way in which we work, and advocating for that, and as you say, productizing it sometimes.
Again, it's a fascinating time to be alive.
Yes, it is. You're right. Okay, so let's go for what things organizations can do, individuals can do, who value this flexibility and in particular want to be remote. What are some of the things that your Grow Placeless program is looking at? What are some of the things that we can, I mean, you've already mentioned so many. In fact, let's start from the first one, because you've got the dangers to remote career advancement. Are there any that we need to add to everything?
Oh my gosh. Okay. So there are many dangers. I don't mean to, alarm anyone. But there are things that we need to be aware of if somebody has identified flexibility as a critical aspect of their career. These are just things that you need to be aware of. And Grow Placeless is a self-paced course that helps individuals address those challenges. So it really is from the perspective of somebody who works in an organization and may or may not have a lot of autonomy or decision-making, but what are the things that they can control so that they can access the flexibility that they want. So when it comes to obstacles to progressing in remote careers, you have the number one issue that there's not enough remote jobs. Okay, so supply is much lower than demand. Many people want flexibility, and the reality is that the jobs that are publicly posted are not offering the level of flexibility that people want. That's a huge issue. So you're competing. So if you're looking internally, you're looking externally, you're competing with many other people to access the jobs that you want. So that's the first thing. The next thing is that there's not enough examples of leadership or career progression that highlight flexibility. So when you look at career paths, and I've already mentioned this in organizations, that's one thing that they can do. But on an individual level, it really is up to you to identify people who have had flexibility in their career to model your career after people that inspire you. Another danger is productivity paranoia. So this is huge issue, right? Where managers just don't believe that remote employees are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And this is a pervasive belief that it's a huge challenge, right? Because if you are doing what you're supposed to be doing, you're working from home, you're working from a co-working space, but your manager just doesn't believe that you're doing what you need to be doing. I mean, you're not going to progress, in that company if your manager has any say in what you're doing. So that's a big challenge. Then lack of visibility. So in hybrid teams especially, it's really challenging to make sure that remote workers are able to make their contributions visible to the same level that in-office employees are. And one of the biggest challenges with remote work is usually to combat that challenge, remote workers try to be ultra responsive or they overwork to overcompensate for this lack of visibility. It's really a problem that, is exacerbated, right? Because you have the lack of visibility. And then when you're trying to increase your visibility, you're overworking yourself. So you are more prone to burnout. So remote workers need to make their contributions visible without defaulting to that ultra responsive overworking mentality.
Yeah. And is this an issue as well as just maybe some presenteeism happening?
Yes.
As well. I'm also thinking that something that people might not be aware of unless they're thinking about this stuff all day like we are, is all the work that gets shared when you're physically with someone, all the conversations that we have around what you're doing or hearing someone on the phone with a client or something, and that is not there when you're away from each other. It's not just the presence that is being felt, but also the work around that presence. So
yeah, so that's a great example too of some of the things that remote workers are trying to solve for, right? They're trying to, okay, nobody can hear me on the phone with this client. So how do I make sure that they know that I've talked to the client, right? That's an excellent example of something that a remote worker needs to solve for in order to achieve or get access to the opportunities that they want. And then another challenge is companies rescinding or limiting remote work policies. So you get a remote job and all's good. And then, a few months later, you're called back into the office. Yeah. So that goes along with the challenge of there not being enough remote jobs. There's not enough truly remote jobs, and companies are not necessarily committed to long-term flexibility, and they're not always transparent.
Okay.
When it comes to what those plans are.
That's such a, I mean, we're not touching on recruitment and job searching now, but actually that is something I hadn't thought of. That if you are looking for a remote job, especially in a large organization, and at the moment everything seems like it's exactly what you want, to have that conversation to understand whether this is still a short-term thing while they catch up with time,
yeah,
or whether actually it might well revert. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, and so again, I'm going to go back to this advocacy a bit, because in Grow Placeless, that's one of the modules is on advocating for workplace flexibility. And a component of that is really understanding your flexible work policy that is at your organization now or at the organization that you're applying to, and really understanding what that flexible work policy means, and also evaluating the public stance of high-level leadership on remote work or flexible work. And if it's a large enough company, you'll find comments, right? We won't name names, but you'll find, evidence of leadership's attitudes towards flexible work. For, smaller companies or companies that, don't have very highly visible leaders, it might be a little bit harder to find. But if an organization is offering any kind of flexible work, they should have a flexible work policy that you should be able to ask about and determine what are the resources available to you to make sure that you are successful in that flexible role, and also what activities or what resources the organization makes available to make flexible work work on, a company level as well.
You can also ask, where are the CEO and the senior leadership team based? And how many days?
Exactly. And ask about where current leaders, what level of flexibility they have, what level of flexibility do, the supervisor that you'd be reporting to, asking about the levels of flexibility that are not just theoretically available, but what do people actually implement on a daily basis? That tells you a lot about whether people feel comfortable accessing the flexibility that their role says that they have.
Very good. Well, listeners, this is such valuable thinking. There's a lot in there. Just to wrap up, Tammy, the Grow Placeless program, can you just take us very, very quickly through the other modules, just to give us an idea? One, I am very happy to refer listeners over to you and take the course, or at least check out your content, as always, in workplaceless.com. But also just to get us thinking as well, because the modules actually speak a lot about what we need to be thinking of. So just in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, exactly. So the first module is what you said before, the dangers to remote career advancement. The next module is how to combat proximity bias. So learn strategies to stay top of mind across distance without relying on, presenteeism and, overloading people with communication. How to build social capital across distance. So how do you develop meaningful connections in remote and hybrid teams? There's some really interesting differences between remote and co-located work when it comes to developing your network. How to make contributions visible. So how to leverage asynchronous communication to make your achievements visible to your team as well as the organization at large. How to design a flexible career. And then how to advocate for flexible work, how to build the business case for flexible work for yourself, for society.
Nice. I think we have to come get you back. I think especially the build social capital across distance is something that actually organizations are also worried about. And finally have started to think, we need a deliberate strategy for this now.
Yes, yeah. And as I mentioned before, Grow Placeless is really about what the individual can do, understanding that not every organization gives employees the autonomy that we think that employees should have. But even if you don't have a lot of autonomy in your current role, you have complete control over your career. It's a question of finding the resources and taking advantage of the resources that you do have to achieve your next career goal.
Tammy, well, thank you so much for joining us again. Listeners, check out all the work that Workplaceless are doing at workplaceless.com. Where's the best place to connect with you? LinkedIn?
LinkedIn.
Yeah, excellent. We'll put the link in the show notes. Any last aspirational words for the future, Tammy? What are you excited about in the next, year or 2 years in the world of work?
In the world of work. I have to say that this space that we're in is never boring. And so who knows what the big question will be next year? I mean, this year it's been AI. Yes. I'm just excited to see what the next big question is going to be. We're still working on so many things in the world of work, but I'm just blown away by how many new things are cropping up and the creativity that people and companies exhibit in solving problems. I just think it's a fascinating time to be in this space.
Thanks, Tammy.
Thank you, Pilar.
Well, thank you so much, Tammy Bjelland from Workplaceless. I think what also good to remember as well is how broad the virtual space is, the remote work space is. And of course, with Tammy, we've been talking mainly about how remote workers who are probably in the same location as their headquarters or who are part of teams that are quite localized, how do they progress through their careers? But if we start to look at the remote space more broadly, we also see international teams and global teams. And of course, that also has its challenges. So for that, I thought I asked Theresa Hollema, who is, well, she's been on the show a few times, and she is the author of Virtual Teams Across Cultures. And she's now, you've got to check this out, she's got a new site called virtualacrosscultures.com. So she's the brains behind that, and it's got loads of resources for working internationally. And she's got some thoughts on the whole career progression thing, but around global teams. So I've actually got her here with me. Hello.
Hi, Pilar. Great to be here again. Great to see you and speak with you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for listening, having a listen through the conversation with Tammy, because I would love to hear your thoughts on how what she's saying is similar and how it's different from what you are thinking about when you're thinking about, well, career progression in global teams where people they might not be working from home. They might just be working from company offices in another country. So we're talking global teams, the classic definition of virtual teams. So what were your thoughts?
So I really enjoyed your interview with Tammy. Fantastic. And there were a couple things that really triggered me or really were very interesting that I saw parallels and connections, of course, with global working. For instance, visibility. How do we make sure that people who are managers and people who make decisions can see the work that we're doing? Presenteeism. How do I communicate to show and tell what I'm doing? Things like that. How do I get noticed? And what's really interesting for me, at least, when I look at people who are trying to work globally and look at global organizations, is that they are tapping into talent all over the world. And it's becoming more and more. They're not being restricted by location. They're saying, let's put this project together. Let's pull the talent from one place, another place. So I'm seeing and hearing that more and more in multinational organizations, which is great. But these people who are joining these teams or who are sitting in these different locations also want to develop their careers. And that becomes very interesting, but also challenging as well. There's some very interesting research that came out from professors Iana Cristia and Paul Leonardi. They're at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And they had a research that the title of the paper is called Get Noticed and Die Trying, Signal, Sacrifice, and the Production of FaceTime and Distributed Work. What a great title.
Whoa.
I loved it. What was great about their research is the conclusions that they made are things that I hear and that we've been recognizing for years, which is HQ has a bias, but also puts stress on the rest of the organization. And people within the rest of the organization try to get noticed. So if I can go into the detail of the study a little bit, just to give you a reference, they looked at two organizations. One was an automotive and the other one was high tech. And both had strong HQs, which many multinationals do. So if you want to develop your career, what do you want? You want to be on high-profile projects, right? You want to be on projects that give you expansion, where you are getting the mentoring and the coaching that you need and that you can develop as a professional. So in this study, people were trying to get the attention of HQ to put them on these great projects, these high desirable projects. And what they found was that people were trying in many different ways and trying to get the attention. And some of those were putting added stress on them, on their lives, on their personal lives, and also became an expectation of HQ. So, for instance, a meeting on a Friday night at 8 o'clock in, let's say, China, and the HQ is somewhere in Europe. There becomes an expectation from HQ to say, yeah, they better show up. That's how we see the commitment. Or that they are somebody who's not in HQ has to be very responsive to pings and texts and emails and things like that. And HQ starts to say, yeah, I expect that because that shows their commitment. So all of these signals of showing commitment were actually adding a lot of stress towards people and their work-life balance. But it became the norm because HQ was saying, yeah, that is the norm. People are doing it, so it must become normal. And all of a sudden, people are just burning out.
Yeah, people are doing it. That's the problem. Yeah.
So I think you recognize it, right? It's something that we all see. Yeah. But it adds a complexity then and a stress towards people who just want to develop their careers in these multinationals. And multinationals want people to develop their careers, of course. Yes. But the question now is, can we do it without having to relocate to HQ? And I hope the answer is yes. And I hope we can continue to develop and build on Tammy's work and other work to make this a reality so that we can become location independent as we work virtually and globally.
So for me, one of the issues might be that the way you're talking about this in particular is that it's HQ that's driving maybe the projects, the high-profile projects. And I wonder if the most successful global organizations maybe are distributing that as well. So to make sure that it's not always the same location that drives the high-profile projects.
Very good question. It's a question of where are the resources, where are the decision makers, these type of topics is, and are these distributed or not? And each organization is different. But then you also start to see hubs. So we can say, yes, we distribute, for instance, R&D. R&D is in 3 different places around the world. But then all of a sudden, those R&D become the de facto HQ when you want to develop your career.
Yes.
So it's something that companies really need to pay attention to, because this talent who perhaps don't want to relocate, but want to develop their careers, if they are burning out and not getting the projects and the opportunities, they'll leave. Or they'll, not be as contributing as they could have been. So it's a risk.
So hopefully we can crisscross. We can cross over some of the learnings of the remote working from home hubs and making them able to access development opportunities, etc. We can cross that over also to what's going on in global organizations, by which I mean it's just that mindset of who are we forgetting about and who's driving this?
Very well said. Very well said. This is a bias or a stress in the organization that's because of our attitude, because of our biases, right? HQ or whatever the hub is, are perhaps preferring people that are local or giving the preferred projects to more local people. So the distant people are trying everything they can to get the attention. But if we can put mechanisms in place where, as you're saying, how can we actively tap into that talent? How can we actively see the talent even though they're not physically with us? I think companies can absolutely move in that direction. And as you're saying, with the talent, with many of the comments that Tammy was referencing, can absolutely be brought into this global space as well.
So, is there anything else you wanted to bring up?
No, I think that's it. I just wanted to tap into or, contribute that little bit of a global perspective when we're talking about careers. So thanks for the opportunity.
Well, before you go, though, tell us about the relatively new site, virtualacrosscultures.com. What kind of stuff can we find there?
So I'm going very deep in this topic, virtual across cultures. So we have organizations that have been working internationally and working virtually, remotely for years, but it's increased because of the pandemic, but also because technology is improving, talent is everywhere, more and more research, there's more and more opportunities. And I find that fascinating. How can people work across cultures virtually? What's new? How can we improve this? This is not going away. It is the reality. And so I'm continuously looking at research and at stories, at what companies are doing. And I will be sharing that on the site, but also in LinkedIn. So I would be very happy to connect on LinkedIn or, have conversations with people who visit my website. And that's what they can find, a real focus on how can we do this global work and develop the talents and the competence to be able to do that well.
So listeners, we'll put the LinkedIn link on the show notes, but if not, Theresa Hollema, you can find her on LinkedIn and also virtualacrosscultures.com. Well, thanks for stopping by, Theresa.
Thanks, Pilar. Great to talk to you as always.
A big thank you to Ross Winter for polishing the audio of this episode. And thank you, listeners, for choosing to listen to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. Remember to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app, and you can check out the full show notes over at virtualnotdistant.com/podcasts. Talking of podcasts, we have another show you can listen to, Management Cafe, which you should also be able to find on all podcast apps. I have been Pilar Ortiz. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.